Congratulations on choosing one of 3 Dayco replacement tensioners which feature a combination bracket. Models 288, 301, and 302. All 3 feature Dayco's patented flat spring technology for a more consistent range of torque. These tensioners have been designed and manufactured by Dayco to meet, and in many cases exceed, the performance requirements of the OEM tensioners on the applications shown. Here are some installation procedures for these tensioners. Our featured vehicle is a 2002 Chevrolet Impala with a 3.8-liter engine, which uses the 302 tensioner. Installation procedures for models 288 and 301 will be very similar, though not identical. The tools you'll need to install the new tensioner are an 8mm socket wrench to remove the battery cable, a 15mm socket wrench, breaker bar or belt tool to rotate the tensioner arm, a 10mm socket for the overflow tank and hose brackets, a 15mm socket for the alternator support bracket, a flathead screwdriver to remove the hoses, an abrasive pad and wire brush for cleaning surfaces, and finally, a torque wrench. The new parts you'll need to install are a Dayco 5060918W profile belt, along with the 302 tensioner, which includes 2 replacement elbows with O-rings, and 3 separate replacement O-rings. For safety's sake, turn off the engine, take the keys out of the ignition, and disconnect the negative battery cable. Since coolant is routed through the tensioner, the radiator must be drained before proceeding. To gain access to the radiator's petcock, remove the front driver's side wheel and the splash guard on the interior of the wheel well. Open the petcock and allow the coolant to drain. When finished, close the petcock, then reinstall the splash guard and wheel. Remove the engine cover to allow easier access to the accessory drive. Now you're ready to remove the old belt from the tensioner. Using a 15mm socket wrench or tensioner tool as shown, engage the tensioner pulley bolt. Apply leverage to rotate the tensioner arm, releasing tension on the belt. Remove the belt from the alternator pulley first. Relax the tensioner arm and disengage the tool. Then take the belt off the rest of the drive. The tensioner and tensioner pulley are now clearly visible below the alternator pulley. Next, using a 10mm socket, remove the 2 bolts that secure the overflow tank, then remove the tank. This is a good time to check all the accessory drive pulleys to make sure they move freely and don't exhibit excessive rock, which could indicate bearing problems. Now, use a 15mm wrench to remove the front nut securing the alternator support bracket. Use a 10mm socket to remove the rear nut, then remove the bracket. Return to the 15mm wrench to remove the upper alternator mounting nut from the threaded mounting stud. The 15mm wrench is also used on the lower alternator mounting bolt. The alternator can now be lifted up and temporarily placed out of the way. This allows much better access to the tensioner. The next step, using a 10mm socket, is to remove the bolts on the hose retention brackets. On the rear hose, the bolt is next to the hose. On the front hose retention bracket, the bolt is located below the hose. Once the bolts are removed, use a screwdriver if needed to help pry the hoses out of the tensioner. The old O-rings will be replaced. Store the hoses out of the way for now. Using a 15mm socket, loosen and then remove the 3 bolts that secure the tensioner, top, bottom, and side. There are 2 elbows that go from the tensioner into the engine. These are usually frozen, and care must be taken during removal. Using a screwdriver to help pry the elbows out of the engine, lift the tensioner up and out of the engine compartment. Now the elbow placement can be clearly seen. Next, use an abrasive pad to clean out the ports from which the elbows were removed of any debris that may be left. Use the pad to also clean the tensioner mounting surface to ensure that no debris is lodged between these surfaces and the tensioner, which could cause alignment problems and allow the mounting bolts to loosen over time. You are now ready to install the new tensioner. Begin by using silicone grease to lubricate the 2 ports for the plastic elbows. After lubricating, snap the elbows into place. Also apply silicone grease to the O-rings on the exposed ends of the two elbows. Next, use a screwdriver to help remove the old O-rings from the heater hoses that were removed from the tensioner. Use a wire brush to clean the ends of the hoses of any old O-ring debris and corrosion to prepare them for the installation of the new O-rings. Once the new O-rings have been installed, lubricate them with the silicone grease. Carefully position the tensioner so that the elbows line up with their respective ports. Push the tensioner toward the engine. The elbows will hold it in place. Begin threading in the 3 original tensioner bolts by hand. With the 15 mm socket, continue threading and snugging up the 3 tensioner bolts. Finally, use a torque wrench to tighten the 3 bolts to 25 foot-pounds. Next, reinsert the 2 heater hoses into the tensioner assembly. Reinstall the 2 original hose retention bracket bolts, starting to thread them by hand, and finish tightening with a 10 mm socket. When replacing a worn-out or failed tensioner, Dayco recommends replacing the serpentine belt with a new W-profile poly rib belt, since the old belt may be near its effective service life or may have been damaged. Before installing the new belt, clean the pulleys to make sure there is no grease or coolant residue. Next, reinstall the alternator, making sure the wiring harness is connected correctly. Put the 2 alternator bolts through their respective holes, then begin threading each one in by hand and finish tightening with a 15 mm wrench. Put the alternator support brace back in place and thread the original nuts onto their respective mounting studs by hand. Finish tightening with the 15 mm socket on the front nut and the 10 mm socket on the rear nut. You are now ready to install the new serpentine belt. Carefully thread the belt around the tensioner pulley and all the pulleys in the accessory drive, except the alternator pulley. A routing diagram can be found on the back of the Dayco belt sleeve, or on the vehicle under the hood. Put the 15 mm belt tool onto the tensioner pulley bolt. Apply leverage to rotate the tensioner arm and carefully install the belt onto the alternator pulley. Relax the tensioner arm and disengage the tool. Reconnect the battery cable, overflow tank, and engine cover, and replace the coolant. Then have an assistant start the engine while you visually verify that the belt is seated properly in all the accessories. Run the engine briefly to seat the belt. Dayco is a leading worldwide manufacturer of automotive and heavy-duty replacement tensioners, featuring its patented flat spring technology. Buying Dayco means you're buying the best.